and I'd like to welcome you to your last session of the 2018 Cali Conference. So celebrate or not, depending on how you're feeling right now. But we're going to talk about teaching a synchronous online class using WebEx. So let me start by introducing the presenters today, and we're all from Elon University School of Law. So we're starting with Jeff Chilcott, who's Elon's Instructional Technologist, Abigail Deese, who's a reference librarian, and she will discuss course design, Charlie Perkins, who is our Access Services Librarian, and will discuss the professionalism issues which have arisen during the courses. And I'm Kate McLeod, and I'm going to start by providing an overview of Elon's journey to online course approval process and how we're working through that.
If you go back one more second, some of us were still signing in.
Yeah, of course. It's on the board as well.
But the
I'm sorry,
angle
I
may be
didn't see that.
bad.
Okay. No, it's okay.
Better just take it.
So, as you all know, the standards for courses is controlled by the ABA Chapter 3 of the standards, which talk about the program of legal education. Distance education not only has to meet all of the other standards of Chapter 3, but also has its own standard, which is 306. What we're going to talk about today are specifically two sections of 306 as we do this presentation. And that is 306C, which deals with the establishment of which deals with the additional requirements for resources, staffing, facilities, on how you're going to present a distance education course. In addition, Section D, which deals with the interaction requirements between faculty and students in order to meet the current Chapter 3 standards. So as we move through this, we're going to make sure before we move on from the standards that you're aware of the new proposed changes to Section 306 that came down in the May meeting of the Council of Legal Education. So there have been two major changes in those standards. Under the old standards, you know, we could have 10 credits of distance education, which would count towards your degree. The proposed standard is for it to be up to 1/3 of your degree. So looking at what is the minimum number of degrees and what is generally the maximum number of degrees that are required for graduation, that means a student could now have between 28 and 30 credits towards graduation through distance education. In addition, 1L courses, which have traditionally not allowed any online distance education courses, are now going to have up to 10 credits of their 1-year courses will be allowable towards graduation. This is going to make significant demands for increased distance education courses at probably all of our law schools. So, why did Elon start a couple of years ago with these issues? We're predating the changes to the council. And that is because although Elon is a small school in Greensboro, North Carolina, we have a residency requirement for all of our 2L students. So all of our 2L students enter either in the winter or spring trimester are required to work a full-time 35-hour-a-week placement at a law-related situation. Firms, legal aid, government offices, kind of think almost anything you can think of. In addition to that, in order to graduate on time in our 2.5-year program, they need to carry another 3-credit accompanying course. For the majority of our students, that's really not an issue. They either come to an early morning class at 8 o'clock in the morning, or they come at 5:30 and take one of our evening classes. So they get their 3 credits that way. However, what do we do with our students who are in distance placements? We define a distance placement as any placement more than 30 miles away from Greensboro. So in other words, they can't get out of work at 4:30 in the afternoon and make sure they can get back to Greensboro for a 5:30 class. Therefore, we had to immediately start to deal with how are we going to approve distance education courses? What are our offerings going to be? So these became really requirements for what we're going to do in our curriculum. So, having talked about that requirement, the curriculum committee started to work on this problem. For us, for the problem, how are we going to do this? How are we going to approve courses? What do we need to do? So the first thing we did is we looked at 306 and we said that our interpretation of 306 is even if a course has already been approved for inclusion in the catalog and has been taught before, if we want to do it as a distance education situation, it must be reapproved by the curriculum committee. So one of the examples I have of that is administrative law. We absolutely had administrative law in our curriculum from the very beginning. However, now we teach it synchronous at 8 a.m. in the morning. So what do we do? What did we have to do? We had to develop the policies. We had to figure out how we were going to do this and how are we going to shepherd that course through curriculum different from any other course that we traditionally approve. So we require that the course be resubmitted by the faculty or by the academic dean, that it has to also be accompanied by information from the instructor on how they are going to meet Elon's distance education policy, and they have to answer 5 to 6 questions in writing for us so that we have some kind of accountability that says this is what my plan is, and part of that is to make them think about how they're going to do it in advance. So that's really how we take it through the basics. Now you're going to say, well, how do you develop a distance learning program? And so I'm going to tell you there's some really great resources out there that will help you do this as an institution. And they've been developed and published by the Working Group for Distance Learning in Legal Education. They are freely available from their website for download and printing distribution to all your faculty if you want to. The one from 2005, which you have the pretty colored picture of the handout there, includes model policies for law school distribution, distance education policies. It also includes policies for student training and behavior and suggested guidelines for instructor and faculty online behavior and education. In addition, they have published the best practices to be used accompanying that, where they discuss issues that they have found over time, which were issues such as technology, student assessment, what's worked, what hasn't, how should you be evaluating different things, what do you need to think about in course design. Excellent resources for you to use when you are dealing with someone who wants to develop a distance course. So we took their model distance education policies and other policies and adopted them to meet our needs based on 3 additional standards. We acknowledged, with a little discussion with the faculty, that the students are not necessarily technologically able to walk into a distance course with their knowledge that they come to law school. So all distance courses, students must first go to an online training program before they are allowed to register for a synchronous distance course. We also are encouraging strongly that the faculty or instructor develop their course design using not only the in-house assistance we have with Jeff here, but also using the university department, which is totally housed by instructional technologists, which for us is called Teaching and Learning Technologies. I'm sure your universities have a similar department, different names, we understand that. We also acknowledge that you need to provide technical support for both the instructor and the students, and that technical support should be available at all times that the class is being taught. So those were the three principles we used when we developed our own model policies. Now I'm going to turn this over to Jeff, who's going to talk about technology and other issues.
Sounds like we might be having a display issue. Are you guys seeing the notes on your screen? Yeah.
No, on the,
No, is anybody logged in?
are you in the WebEx classroom? Are you seeing the note slides? Okay.
No?
Just see what's up there and your presenter
We
view.
see the next.
Yeah,
Yeah, we see your presenter view.
You're seeing that. This is what they're seeing.
Okay. Does that fix it? That
Yes.
change
Yes.
it?
Yeah, we're
Now we
good.
just see the slide.
That's the way it should be. And these are the sorts of issues you run into. You live and you learn. So I'm gonna, yep. Yeah, click back on there so you can use this. I'm gonna talk about the synchronous course technology that we used for all of the courses that we've kind of started. Maybe back in 2015 is when we kind of started dabbling in synchronous course work. These are a few questions that you need to ask yourself before you start getting into synchronous instruction. You got to know what kind of platform you're working with. You got to figure out what kind of equipment you're going to be using. You got to nail down a physical location within one of your buildings that works for this sort of thing. And then you got to really start to think about how you're going to deliver that content through that medium. If you don't start asking these questions, then you're going to crash and burn, or you're going to be stumbling along the way. So you need to know what kind of video conference platform that you're going to use. There's a lot of them out there. We use WebEx. There's also GoToMeeting, Zoom, and Skype, and I'm sure you know of a bunch more. And you really got to kind of get familiar with those features and functions before you make a decision on what kind of platform you're going to move to. Our main campus technology department decided that we were moving to WebEx, so that's what we ended up using, but you might want to have a discussion with your technology department before they make those decisions. Once you've got a platform, you got to figure out what type of equipment you're going to need. Are you going to go with a more low rent sort of setup, or are you going to splurge on a nice unit to use, or have a dedicated room for that distance learning? The physical location is very important. If you have money for a dedicated video conferencing room, then you're a very lucky law school. We do not, but others do. If you don't have that, maybe you have an environment that's a little bit more collaborative, where you've got desks that you can move around, movable furniture that you can kind of set up for that sort of situation. Or maybe you have a traditional classroom like the one we're in, where you kind of have to adapt a little bit more, kind of in the way that we've set up what we've got right here. And again, content delivery is very important. You can't just decide 2 weeks beforehand that you're going to flip that course into a synchronous online course. It just does not work that way. You got to think about asynchronous components for the sync that work with those synchronous components. And you got to think about your teaching style. You can't just say, well, I'm used to teaching with the whiteboard, so I'm going to go in there and use the whiteboard. It just doesn't translate the way that you think it would. So you got to think of the functionality of the platform that you're using and how to best use that. If you like to do activities and group work, there are ways to do that. You just have to really test things out and plan in order to be successful. So when we started to dabble with our synchronous classes, we knew, first of all, like I said before, that WebEx was going going to be the platform that we used. And once we started, yeah, see, this is the sort of thing you deal with. So if your speaker's on or you've got your mic going, then you're going to get some sort of feedback. And that's a perfect example of one of those things that just tends to happen, and you have to kind of work around it. Within WebEx, there are three interfaces for conferencing. There's the meeting center, the training center, the event center. I'm not going to get too detailed. I'm especially not going to talk about the event center because that's for events. Usually you have more than 300 people joining in online. Some of the common features are the screen sharing, the chatting, the recording, note-taking, and especially the breakout rooms, which the librarians made use of later. This is just a slide of how the interfaces look very much alike, but they do have a few feature differences. Meetings, here's a blow up of the meeting room. You can see there's the chat function, the recorder function up in the right hand corner. You've got your screen share there in the middle. And then here's training room. So they're very similar, but that's the reason that I bring it up is because you've got to test these features out before you go live, or else you're going to have some real issues. When we started thinking about the physical location of the online class, we started thinking about the classrooms. So we've got traditional classrooms like the one here. We've got about 5 of those, plus a computer lab that's down in the basement in the library. We've got a collaborative learning situation. We've got two rooms that are kind of like that. One of the rooms didn't have an internet drop, so we just went ahead and marked that one out. So that left us with one room left over. Of course, we didn't have a dedicated video conferencing room, but we did, when we signed our contract with Cisco, we did receive a telepresence unit. It's a standalone unit. It does have wheels, but it's got a single high-definition camera and 2 high-fidelity tabletop microphones. So here's what room 107 looks like. This is the room that we decided we were going to go with. And you can see it back there in the corner. It's not the ideal situation, but we kind of just had to make it work. So this is kind of our conference table. We call it conference table setup, just for lack of a better term. We use this setup most regularly. We started with the residencies. They would use it more as like a glorified conference call, a round table discussion. It would be a very small class. Obviously, you can't fit too many students around that table. There were instances where I maybe set up a few more tables that were outside of that circle. And that worked, but it wasn't, again, it's not the ideal setup. You kind of have to work with what you've got. The International Law class was a little bit more heavy on the using the functionalities of WebEx. There was a lot more screen sharing. The students were allowed to present at the end of the course. But we also found that we had some issues when the professor was trying to share long-form videos. Some of the video content wouldn't translate, and that's why I mentioned earlier, when you start thinking about the way that you teach, your style of teaching, if you're using a lot of media content, you got to test it out, see if it works on that platform. Maybe you want to throw something on your on Twin or a CMS that you've got, and you can put your media up there, have them watch before you come to the synchronous class session. The last setup I want to talk about with the telepresence unit was, I call it telepresence as student. So the professor didn't really want to sit. He wanted to keep his lecture style as similar to what he was doing in his live class as possible. He wanted to stand over there at the whiteboard and write on the whiteboard. And so I worked with him. We set up some preloaded camera angles that would zoom into the whiteboard. He would have to touch on the tablet when he went up to the whiteboard. I think he stumbled along the way, but I guess he figured it out and got comfortable at some point with that style. So next thing I want to talk about is how much I love the law librarians, because they ask questions, they plan, they test, they ask questions, plan, and test, and they do it over again. Not everybody does that. It's so important. When we started discussing their legal research course and how they wanted to do it, we found out, there were a couple things along the way that just wouldn't work. We were using Meeting Center for just about every course up until that point. We realized that Meeting Center does not allow for these breakout sessions that they wanted to do. So we flipped over to Training Center. We decided that, or we didn't decide, we found out that Training Center is not compatible with the telepresence unit. So then we had to switch rooms. So we decided to go down to the computer lab. This is our computer lab down in the law library. Once you get into a situation where you don't have the high-end equipment, you got to think about the little things like, how's the audio coming across? How are we going to reduce the feedback? What kind of visual are we presenting? What kind of camera are we using? Do we want an angle of the room? Do we want an angle of the presenter? Do we want to just share our screen and kind of have a voiceover of slides? This is a shot from the back of the room. You have to consider the students that are live in the room as well as the ones that are remote. So one of the things the librarians decided to do was to encourage all the students to sign into that WebEx session much the way that you're signed in if you're signed in here, and share the content out that way. Because if you're at the back of the room, maybe it's a little bit hard to see if you're on a website, if you're tooling around and you want to show them how to navigate a website. It's just nicer to have them looking at the same screen you're looking at. And that way the student that's remote is getting the same, relatively the same experience. We also found out, I guess, I don't know how far into the course, but the remote students requested that they see the rest of their students in the classroom. So we set up a webcam, and here's my cartoon layout of the computer lab. We set up a webcam much like this. We hooked it into the presenter station, and so that student felt more like she was involved with the class. You'll also notice that the instructor has a headset on, and that each one of the students in the room were also encouraged to wear headsets. That way that they could, when they broke out into the smaller group sessions, they could speak to those remote students. And that way you're eliminating the feedback that you would get if you were using the speakers on the desk to project the sound from the remote students. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Abby, and she's going to talk about the course design.
So all of this sort of leads one step into the next. So Jeff has talked about sort of the equipment and the technology that we used, and the way that we had to think about what we could do with the space we had available and the equipment and the technology we had available on the cheap. But then once all of that's done, you have to think, like he said, about how you're going to deliver content, how you're going to design your content for a synchronous online class. And I'm really sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so if my voice is kind of rough, I am so sorry. I'll try not to start coughing in the middle of this. So we've been doing advanced legal research as a synchronous online class since 2016. We've taught it 3 times. And we've done that, like Kate said, to meet our residency requirements and to provide a class that students can take to get 3 credit hours while they're working full-time in one of these placements. And one of the things we wanted to accomplish with this course, we really wanted to meet those ABA standards, and the reason we went with Training Center for those breakout sessions was because that was a way for us to simulate the in-class experience, the classroom experience students have of breaking out into small groups and working on short research assignments. So the standards I'm talking about in particular here are 306D, the ones about regular substantive interaction between faculty and students, and then the monitoring of student effort. So the breakout sessions are nice because we could break students out into little groups. Instructors could jump into those groups and oversee their work and answer questions, kind of like you would do in a live classroom where you're wandering while students are working and answering questions and kind of doing one-on-one lessons. So we were trying to get as much of a live in-person experience for students to meet those standards. And part of that was also to use those best practices one of the things that we did in the course design is we tried to plan to have at least 2 instructors because it's a skills class. So there's a lot more hands-on work than in a doctrinal law class, where you can do a lot more of the lecturing and have your students just observing remotely. Best practices say that it doesn't have to be 2 instructors in an online synchronous course. It could be an instructor and somebody to provide IT support. You guys noticed when you started logging into the WebEx classroom, you still needed to know what the session ID was, or you needed to know what the password was, or speakers were on, and so we were getting feedback instantly as soon as somebody logged in. Those little things can be addressed by the second person in the room while the instructor just goes ahead and starts with the lesson. So our course was designed for an 11-week term. We have a compressed schedule because we're a 2.5-year program, not 3 years. It was a 3-credit-hour course. So that gave us twice a week about an hour and 45 minutes, which is probably as much as you want a student to be in an online class, because it's hard enough to keep their attention when they're in front of you physically. And usually you'll end up having a split of, we ended up having a split of like some in-person students and some people remote, and some of them were in California, so there's a lot of physical and temporal distance there. But that's about as much time as you want to have them in front of you for that, because there's so many more distractions in an online class environment. Twitter and Facebook are right there all the time, and you can't see them doing it. And then we offered it in the evening because our students were in full-time placements, and their placement hosts did not want them breaking out for an hour and a half in the middle of the workday to go take a class. So we accommodated that by doing an evening course from 5:30 to 7:15 every day. That gave people who had a short commute time to get home and connect, because one of the other things was having the appropriate connection speed to transmit voice and video, and also to receive that, and being able to participate in the class fully. It was designed for a smaller class, 4 to 12 students. 4 is really on the small end, but that has happened to us before. And that just means you end up with 2 breakout groups instead of 6. And you don't really want to go larger than 12 for a skills class like this, because then you need a lot more instructors to provide the sort of hands-on instruction that you would get in a smaller in-person class. So the class itself, the way it worked for us, so we had that hour and 45 minutes. One of the things with a synchronous online class, because you're dealing with technology and you're dealing with people who are not in front of you, and you know you're going to have tech support issues, we almost always knew we were going to sacrifice 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of the class for people connecting, getting in the classroom, getting their audio connected, turning off their webcam if it was set to go on automatically, and all of that other stuff. And that's another situation where having a second person was crucial, because they could be dealing with that while the instructor is already starting to go through, like, here's the administrative stuff we have to go over today, and here's something I want to address from last week. And the nice thing about Training Center is you could be doing that. The instructor could be talking through the audio, but there's a chat function. So if you need to answer tech questions, you can be doing that with the students through the chat without having to interrupt the instruction. And the nice thing about this too is you don't have to address the entire room in the chat. You can select specific people. So if somebody's embarrassed and is like, I can't figure out how to get the sound on, they can send you a private message, and you can deal with that out of sight of the rest of the class. So that was usually the first 5 to 10 minutes. We would do a lecture or demo. It was usually more demonstration, because you're doing it as an online class, and because it's a skill, legal research is a skill and not really like a doctrinal lecture type of material. We would have about 30 to 45 minutes of live demo and maybe some info dump if it's like sort of advanced search strategies and that kind of information. And because we were sharing our screens, students could see whether they were with us in the classroom or far away, exactly what we were doing, and follow along pretty easily. And we would go through that. And the other thing, this is another time where having the second person comes into play, because they can answer questions while you are lecturing or demonstrating about material. So usually you're co-teaching, and kind of the way we did it was we pass off from week to week, and somebody would teach one subject module and somebody would teach something else. But while that's happening, the other instructor is answering questions as they come up. So it allows the class to kind of progress without interruptions. It's nice. And once that lecture and demo is taken care of, we start to get into the breakout sessions. And so this was to simulate our in-class small group exercises. Now, in an in-person class, when students are actually in proximity to the law library, they could be using print materials, they can be leaving the computer lab and going to find and put the hands on things, and they can also produce more of a sort of a research plan or even just a short research summary at the end of the class or the exercise. Because we were dealing with online materials only and the students weren't in front of us, we thought it was more beneficial, I think, to do more of the here, teach yourself how to use this now that I've demonstrated it, go and find this information. And so we would do the breakout sessions, and the way they look, and they have some complications. Do I have a mouse? Okay. We have slight interruptions here while I do this. Okay, so this is an image of Training Center, which is what you guys are logged into right now. When you are doing a breakout session, sir. What? Okay. When you're doing a breakout session, it's just a drop down at the top, and it doesn't exist in the meeting rooms. But it's quick and easy. You do it automatically. You set how many groups you want, and it'll just filter your students into however many groups you set. But the one complication is, in this video, and I don't know if we have people connected from mobile devices right now. I think we have a couple. One of the complications with Training Center is the mobile app that lets you log into that class does not support the breakout sessions. So in this slide, you can see there's that little 4 boxes symbol next to some of the users' names. That means they're in a breakout session, so they can work in their small groups together. But the person with the little blue webcam symbol, that person is connecting from a mobile device. They can see everything else from the class. They can see your slides and everything else, but they can't participate in those small group exercises. And that's something you have to know going into this, because if you've got students connecting from their iPhones from the office, they're not going to be able to participate in like half of the class. So they need to know that ahead of time, and you need to know that that's going to happen. It won't kick them out of the training center completely, but it won't throw them into a breakout session. And then because you've got multiple instructors, this thing is extremely touchy. Because you've got multiple instructors, once you've started the breakout sessions, listen, you can actually go and join those sessions. And if you've got 2 or maybe 3 instructors, each of you can hop into a group, and that way you can help as questions come up. If there's only one instructor, you can just move around from group to group. This is just... Okay. Forget that. So you can just hop into your breakout sessions and basically just rotate around to your groups the same way you would float in your classroom. And that was important because at the end of the class, after they had worked on finding things or using, we did a lot of practice materials, stuff we wouldn't have covered in the 1L class. So things like a lot of the Bloomberg materials and the analytics, things we wouldn't have touched in their first year. And those are really neat because they get excited about the neat things you can do with like the Bloomberg and tracking like different stock market prices and getting into all the analytical stuff and the visual materials, because then they can show the rest of the class how they did the exercise. So at the end of the class, we would break them back out of their session and we would throw the ball, as we call it, because you pass a little ball around from presenter to presenter, and they would show what they had done, how they had found the answers to their problem. And so they were reinforcing the lesson through peer teaching. So they were also getting experience with the WebEx platform, because our final project was both a written memo and an oral presentation. And so they needed to get familiar with the platform and the technology, this whole web conferencing interface, because they were going to need to do it to do a professional presentation at the end of the class. And the way we would structure that was either we would do a circuit split and they were clerking for a judge, or they're working in a firm through some bit of complex litigation, and they would have to meet periodically with their partner or their judge. So they would have to learn to make a professional call or a video conference with their boss, and then at the end they'd have to do this oral presentation where they presented their findings, the things they had found through their research project. And in the course of that, we found that a lot of them did not know much about being professional in a video conferencing format, and Charlie is going to talk about that.
All right, thank you very much, Abby. So I'm Charlie Perkins, and I got the professionalism section. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about is a mindset shift that I think is going to be important as we move forward, especially as Kate mentioned, as if 1/3 of your classes are going to be taught online. We don't want to be selling them as ease of use, cost, those kinds of things. We want to be focusing instead, instead of being this is how you can go to class in your pajamas, because let's face it, they already do that when they come to class. But instead what we want to tell them is this is an opportunity to prepare for their life as a future lawyer in practices that are increasingly going to be in virtual spaces. So as a value added, what we're trying to focus them in on is, one, being technically competent, and second, presenting themselves as the professionals they are going to become. To back this up, they are moving into an increasingly virtual office space. 58% of American businesses report using some form of daily communication in the regular course of their business, some type of video in their daily communication. But only about 1/4 of lawyers report doing so, and only 4% do so on a regular basis. So you see, we're well behind the power curve here. And this is something that's going to be asked of our students, and they need to be prepared when they go out. And it's going to be something that could be used as a difference maker. And the growth opportunities are there. Virtual law firms have started to sprout up. These are these places that do everything online. They don't even bother to invest in your traditional brick and mortar offices. And there's, as these charts are showing, they're seeing phenomenal growth. State and federal courts are expanding the use of video conferencing technology. Just as one example, this county in Oregon is using video conferencing as an opportunity to do restraining orders. So people who need restraining orders don't need to be in the same room with the person who needs to be restrained. Also, there are initiatives in places like Minnesota to do distance mediations. And as well, we know that bail hearings are often conducted via teleconference. Expert witnesses can be called in for trials using video conferencing materials. So these are all things that they are going to be doing. So, and beyond just learning the legal research that we're teaching them, we're also teaching them these skills. And of course, our speaker talked at the keynote, talked about ways to increase access to justice. There are some initiatives out here. This is a group of Canadian lawyers who are driving around rural areas of the country to try and create relationships so they can set up these video conferences, increase the access to lawyers who are concentrated in cities to people who might be further flung out in the wilderness, and also the India as a national initiative is trying to roll out additional virtual lawyer opportunities. So these things are happening across the country, around the world. Whether you're dealing with business, dealing with the courts, or you're dealing with access to justice or other social work opportunities, these are things that our students are going to see, and a place where they can really develop the skills they're going to need. We also like to talk about ethics. Everyone in this room is well familiar with Comment 8 of Rule 1.1. If you weren't before you came to this conference, I'm sure you are now. 31 states, actually, I just found out 32 states have adopted it. This infograph kind of shows who those states are. But increasingly also, we want to talk about beyond just the requirement to keep up with technology. Several states, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Washington, Ohio, have actually issued formal ethics opinions about what it takes to ethically operate a virtual office space. And these are great starting off points for discussions with your students about, all right, we're going to have an online conference with this person. At what point do we enter into a client, attorney-client relationship? If we're going to record it, you have to think about the ideas of, well, what states are involved? Do we have permission to record it? We need to make sure everyone on the call understands that. And if we're we also have to think about how is that recording going to be saved? How long is it going to be saved? And what needs to be done when it needs to be destroyed? All of these are ethical issues that they may not even think about. They're so used to just using things like FaceTime in order to connect via virtual, via their phones, that the idea that these kind of record keeping and formal procedures need to be adhered to might catch them by surprise, and we don't want that to happen to them. So these are all just opportunities for us to add new elements and new dimensions to our discussions as we make our attorneys practice ready. We also want to give them an opportunity to sound like a professional. And that doesn't mean, and the first thing to do that is invest in the appropriate level of microphone. And that doesn't mean going out and buying one of these recording rigs with a pop filter and running it through a little mini board into your computer. But a lot of them show up with little more than this, which is the AirPods that come with their phones. And these will work in a pinch. It's better certainly than having it broadcast over and we're getting the multiple lines with the feedback. But that little dangling microphone picks up a lot of wind noise, a lot of rustle. And sometimes when you get into these video conferencing software, if you don't have it going through the USB into the sound card, it doesn't work as well. So we encourage them to get some kind of USB connected device. We use the wireless ones because that allows us to get up, move around the classroom, talk to people, but we also have the wired versions. We have an example up here for our students to work with if they don't have their own equipment. We also want to remind them to silence all the alerts on their computer and devices. A comment was made earlier, I think Abby might have mentioned, we can't see them if they're on Facebook and Twitter, but sometimes we can hear them because those things will come right through if they're sharing all their computer audio. So, make sure you go through with your sounds and turn off all of that information. And the number one lesson we want to enforce with our students is that the mute button is their friend. You don't want to share information that you don't intend to share. So whenever you're not talking, make sure you have that button muted. We also want to talk to them a little bit about how to look like a professional. And that's, things as simple as lighting. It might be nice to set up, with the window to your back, but you're going to get these kind of washed out, very shadowy views. The other thing is we've had students kind of working by the light, the glow of their laptop, and that just doesn't give you a very professional looking environment. Think about the camera angles. Now, some of you may think I may be the most narcissistic person on the planet because not only did I use all these pictures of myself in this, but I also have multiple camera angles running on me right now. So if you're in one of the things, you can see how it is. And like, if you look at the one that says Charlie's iPad, basically it's the beard cam, and you're looking straight up my nose, which is, that angle. What you really want instead is something more at this angle. It's kind of like the newscaster angle. A little set off, you see me from the waist up. It's how we're used to seeing people. It's how I see most of you right now. It's that same kind of angle. The other advantage is because it's a little further away, when I'm right up on my computer, I'm probably looking a little bit down because I'm looking at the screen. And every time my eyes move, you see them twitch. And it makes me look very nervous and unsure of myself. But when you set the camera back just a little bit further, suddenly all those tiny little gestures I'm making are not as readily apparent to you all. And it gives a much more polished presentation. However, in this image, I should have cleaned up my office before I took it because you see all my Amazon boxes all stacked up. We've seen dirty laundry, we've seen dishes, all of those things show up, and people just don't even think about it for some reason. I think they think that the camera can't see, half a foot behind them. But, getting them into that mindset as they go is really important. Interruptions are key. For some reason, cats seem to think that their natural place is on a keyboard. So we want to keep, any pets away. That also means, out of the room so you don't hear them. I've done recordings in my apartment when I've been trying to do some videos for a flipped classroom, and that's when my dog decides it's time to have dinner, and you can hear her chewing on her kibble in the background. So I have to go back and wait for her to be done and re-record everything. But if you're on a live call, that comes through. And, so that kind of goes on to the other thing, make sure the doors are locked. Because family and friends can wander through at any given time, and suddenly you go from being the expert on Korean politics to the BBC dad. So one of the things we wanted to talk to you about today, and we hope we've conveyed to you, is when you're teaching an online class, you really need to move into a mindset shift. I mean, it's not just, all right, I'm going to get up, I'm going to give my lecture, and I'm going to do it the same way I did. I'm just going to turn a camera on me, and that's now an online synchronous coursework. As Abby and Jeff and Kate all talked to you about, there are extensive things you need to do in order to plan your course. Things that work in person may not work. So instructors need to give that level of thought to what they're going to do and be ready to adjust their course as they go through when they learn what the limitations of the materials that they're working with are. Students also need to have a mindset shift. This is being in a professional environment. Yes, I know it's online, but online is the new professional environment. So, start treating it like that. It's not just an excuse to not have to get out of your apartment. Co-teaching when you can is great, but certainly make sure you have help. One of the things we didn't really, there were only so many moving parts we could introduce in here, but WebEx has the ability for students to raise hands to ask questions, has a chat function so people can be sending you messages along the way. Having that second person who monitors that suite of information, in addition to doing the technical support that was mentioned earlier, really frees up the principal instructor to focus their energies on delivering the information as clearly and as appropriately as possible. So that's a huge advantage and something that you really need to fight for if they're not giving that to you anyways. And it can be as simple as having a well-trained student worker in the classroom, but it can't be somebody who's taking the class because they need to be focused on learning. And then one of the last thing, think clearly through what technology requirements you have and make those clearly expressed to your students. As we mentioned, we're going to use training rooms so we can have the breakout sessions. That means we tell our students they can't connect using a mobile device because they're not going to be able to participate then. Understanding what the requirements are and what the limitations of your materials are is key to having a successful class, and sharing that with your students early is critical. So that's our presentation. We have 10 minutes to answer any questions. If you want to play with any equipment, if you want to, Jeff, you want to switch from the presentation mode to the control mode so that we can see basically what the
Stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Yep.
Jeff doesn't actually run the software much for
I don't
us.
know how to do anything.
So, what you have up there is you have, the second screen that the instructor can be watching. And, as you can see here, we have the things about being able to, raise your hands, and you can ask, does everyone understand? They can give you a green check mark or a red X. And there are emojis they can throw at you if they're, feeling particularly frisky. So, that's where we are. I know there's a raffle. Yes.
So I know there's some skepticism about any kind of distance education. How are you all measuring outcomes in particular with your faculty, to overcome those concerns?
We do a lot of touches. You mean for us, or how is the law school doing it?
Either. I'm just curious about how you're measuring outcomes to show that distance ed is either as good or better.
Since we teach these, most of the time we have 3 or 4 students in class, and we might have 5 to 6 students or 3 students, or last time we did it we had 5 in and 1 distance. They're given the same assignments, they submit the same assignments.
It's almost 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Good to know.
So we're getting the feedback, and the feedback comes from us to them on a weekly basis. So when we get the assignments, we're going through and saying, did you get it, didn't you get it? We mandate personal meetings either through WebEx or one-on-one personal meetings for every take-home assignment. So we go through the take-home assignment in a 15 to 20-minute meeting with that student to go through what was right, what was wrong, did they have problems. We do a lot of touching. For doctrinal courses, we originally had a doctrinal person scheduled to come with us. Unfortunately, he got a job in one of the county attorney's offices in North Carolina and left employment on last Thursday. So he is not with us to talk about that, but it's the same type of thing. They do have, they're supposed to be telling us what they do. It's all approved by curriculum. We're working with the university to have oversight by TLT on the synchronous and asynchronous course materials so that we have somebody looking at what is being done and not just saying, you filled out the form, we're covered. But they will get, I can't speak to what their evaluations say because I don't see their teaching evaluations. I see our teaching evaluations, but not anybody else's.
Thank you. Yes.
A question on the video conferencing platform, and if you all had it tested or if professors tried it out, or what that process was like in picking and choosing WebEx?
For deciding on WebEx, that was more of a central or main campus IT decision. I did go with them. We went out to Cisco and we did a test session, and we spent a whole day out there. I think we had already had a contract with Cisco for phones and some other stuff, so we I don't know if they gave us a deal or what it was, but
Kind of already steered towards WebEx?
yeah, and we had, before we went with WebEx, I had dabbled with Zoom at the early stages of Zoom, and we had an interview room with a dedicated camera for Skype interviews. So we'd used other platforms, but this was the first professional platform that we decided to pay for. And it has its kinks, but you just kind of learn as you go and you work with it.
Seems like, because we went through a vetting process for the same thing, and it seems each one has its own little kind of quirk, but for some reason our faculty really disliked WebEx.
Yeah.
They were very frustrated with navigating how to get through it, and so they were much happier with Zoom.
We have some faculty like that too.
Yeah.
Faculty had no input.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah, it was definitely a main campus decision that we kind of had to just live with and figure it out as we went. Yeah.
That being said, how's the adoption of faculty and kind of getting them over some of those humps? We touched on it a little bit, but don't elaborate though.
It's challenging. I'm on the curriculum committee, and I was on the subcommittee that drew up our model, our plans and our guidelines and all of that. And it was challenging, and it's going to be continued to be challenging until we have a core group who are doing this on a consistent basis. The one incentive we have that is going to drive this is the students want to take distance summer classes, and for our 10-month faculty contracts, if they teach a summer class, they get paid extra. It is a motivator. And when we were talking about having someone have oversight over their course materials, I pushed very heavily for that to be given to someone on main campus, for the reason that I didn't want an old boys or a good girls network, whichever way we want to look at it, just not wanting to criticize their friends. So if we have a professional I think everybody in TLT has doctorates in learning technologies. if we have somebody there with that kind of credentials, that's who we want to be doing this. And people will work on doing it. I know that in our first year class, we had them review after our first year what were then 40 videos we used for the first year of legal research.
Which is taught as a flipped class.
Right. But they are reviewing again, and we're currently at 76 videos that are used to teach the first year class.
I know from my perspective, being an instructional technologist, I think it helps to get one or two people that really want to buy in. Once they buy in, then they can kind of word of mouth it to everyone else, and that's kind of the strategy that I think that we're employing, because it's a tough sell just on its face to say, now you're going to do this synchronously. It doesn't work so well that way.
Well, as we can tell, if you had the money to build a classroom like this, it's really great. But this is essentially our solution to, we don't have the money to do that. So you can do it without investing. And that's why they all stared at me when they muttered things about on the cheap. I buy the equipment. I live on my budget. It keeps the dean happier.
But it's very easy to do this with a low-tech setup. I mean, we have a doc cam, so if you want to try to demonstrate print materials to remote students, they can't rely on that for their exercise, of course, because they don't have access to it themselves necessarily. But if there's something that you need to present that's physically in front of you, you can use that. They're very plug and play. You plug them in and you share your screen and you're good to go. The headsets we started having on site because we had a lot of students who were trying to use the iPhone earbuds for in-class participation. It's kind of a mixed bag experience, so we just thought it was easier to have the tech on hand. It's like, this stuff does not cost a lot and it works fine. Probably the biggest investment is going to be the microphone that you get for some of your setups. We ended up with the Yeti because it's got pretty good sound quality and it's pretty flexible for where we need to set it up. And I mean, our webcam is just this little Logitech. This guy gets it done.
On the headset piece, do you recommend they purchase a headset then, or does each student that takes an online class receive one? Or
They do not receive one. We have them for checkout for the students who are in the classroom, because we can't require that they have tech. But if you're taking a distance class, you are required, and we give them a technology list of what they have to have in order to take a distance class. So it's kind of the carrot and the stick. But the corded headsets are $17. We're not asking them to pay even $100 for one. The only reason we won't have cordless ones for students is we think they'd lose the doggles. And then we're replacing those headsets. So I want all one piece. When they bring it back, I want the plug-in USB attached to the headset.
Yeah. And a student taking it remotely, as long as they've got a quiet location, would be able to just use the computer speaker and built-in mic, because they're not going to be having the feedback issue. It's when we have 12 of them all in one small space that the headsets become vitally important.
Yeah, and you guys will notice as you logged into the classroom, you were muted automatically. That's a setting that you can have on your class, and we schedule our classes so the room is available when they log in, and that cuts out a lot of the issues. It's not persistent, though. If they join a breakout session and come back, it unmutes, so it does have some finicky bits, but that's something you can do so you don't have to worry so much about the feedback when your students are logging into your classroom.
Well, thank you all for your attention. We'll be happy to answer any questions.